afternoon and welcome to this episode of Bright Blue TV. I'm Phoebe Arsenagic-Wakefield, Senior Researcher at Bright Blue. Today we consider the housing crisis and the government's proposed planning reforms, asking, are NIMBYs the problem? And to answer that question, we are joined by three fantastic guests. Sean Berry, co-leader of the Green Party, Nicholas Boyd-Smith, Director of Creative Streets, a social enterprise which aims to create beautiful, sustainable places to live, and Ant Breach, Senior Analyst at the think tank Centre for Cities, focusing on housing and planning. If you are tweeting about or during the event, then please do use the hashtag BrightBlueTV. And if you'd like to put your own questions to the speakers, you can do so via Slido, using the link in the description of this video. We'd be really delighted to receive them. The UK is in the midst of a housing crisis, and the government's ambition to solve it is by building 300,000 homes a year by the mid-2020s. As part of their plans, announced in the Queen's speech in May, the government has proposed a planning bill, which aims to ensure that more houses can be built by relaxing planning laws, including by making it harder to stop the blocking of development in so-called growth zones. Attacked by opposition parties, the bill also has prominent critics from inside the Conservative Party itself, such as Theresa May, with fears that the reforms will reduce local democracy and see the Tories bleed voters to the Lib Dems, a fear made very real by the Liberal Democrat victory in the Chesham and Amersham by-election in June, declared by the Daily Telegraph a victory for NIMBYs, a group labelled Britain's worst vested interest by Liz Truss in 2019. Others argue that attacks on so-called NIMBYs serve as a distraction from the greed of developers, and that the planning bill could end up a developer's charter with serious environmental implications. And with that, let's go to Sean first. Does the Liberal Democrat victory in the Chesham and Amersham by-election show that NIMBYism is the barrier to solving the housing crisis?
That's me?
Yes.
Okay, brilliant. Also, just to say, I'm acting leader of the Green Party at the moment, not its current co-leader. We're holding an election in which I'm just holding the fort. Meanwhile, and I think the Liberal Democrat messaging in that by-election was very, very clever. The government have made all these announcements. The white paper document isn't super clear about exactly how communities can be involved. It does look like there will be, I think there's some benefit in the new planning ideas of making it more plan-led to get the community involved from the start. Those are principles I absolutely stand by. And then they talk about being able to comment on online maps. And to my mind, the people I know who work on planning issues in the local community, they want much deeper involvement than that. They don't want to comment on an online map beyond which all development will be okayed by right. They want to be able to develop their own ideas, open up opportunities for smaller developers, for cooperatives, for their own stuff to happen. And that fear that the government is merely creating space for things to be imposed on local communities, it was a very strong message in that election, and I think probably decisive.
Fantastic. Thank you, Sean. Nick, are you concerned that the bill could reduce local democracy in terms of development and planning?
I think the key way of thinking about this is, what is the nature of government intervention in the built environment? And what is, how do we wish to regulate this? And in what way? No one's sensible. I mean, there are some unsensible people who talk about this world, but I think no one's sensible, from whatever sort of political background, who's sort of thought about it for 5 minutes, argues there should be no state involvement in how we regulate the built environment, the creation thereof. And even if you do argue that, and some people do, let's go back and look at the Indus Valley. There's very clear evidence that there was some form of state regulation in the development of Indus Valley cities back about 3,000 years ago, more than that. And there has been in every single city and most towns ever since. So let's sort of park that. But then the conversation gets interesting. And then you start saying, well, when do we regulate? And how, and to what end? And I think you said in one of your earlier comments, Phoebe, and forgive me, I'm going to pick you up on this, so forgive me, it's never a smart thing for panelists to do. You said the planning bill was about loosening regulation. I think some of us who sort of fed into it and tried to influence it, and I obviously co-chaired the Building Better, Building Beautiful Commission, so hopefully influenced it a little bit. That's certainly not the case I'd make. I mean, I'd make the case that we need to regulate better and earlier, and that we have a very odd, in fact, an almost unique approach to regulating our built environment, where almost all, not all, but almost all the actual decision-making happens at the development control-led process. Oddly, the reason I was late coming to this, and I'm the reason the call started a bit late, so blame me, not anyone else. Oddly, the reason I've come is because I was involved in a conversation on exactly that. Because actually, it turned out that the local plan wasn't clear about what was required. So, did we need 2 parking places per car or less than 1? Yeah, I'm not going to tell you where it was. Yeah, clear as mud. So that's the problem, because that means that the guy who comes in and makes an assumption about this, which may or may not be a good thing, can in some such circumstances outbid the person who's perhaps making a better assumption in terms of sustainability or quality. So that goes to the heart of it. So if we're going to regulate the built environment, we should. Let's bring that more clearly into plan. The phrase I've tried to use is bring the democracy forward. Now, the uncomfortable consequence of that is if you start trying to better involve the public in setting the local plan, that does come with some consequences that you have to accept that, and I don't think I'm disagreeing with someone here, but maybe I am, and it's said in a constructive spirit, that if you've gone through a proper process to set the local plan, you've got to concede that things within that carapace of acceptability must be easy to develop, and there must be less risk. Because the reason we've got, or one of the key reasons we've got such a concentrated development market, and again, we probably have the most concentrated development market in the Western world. I've not been able to see figures for all countries. Albania, I've not yet managed to get, but almost all the major economies, we've clearly got a much more concentrated development market with far less self-build or custom build. And that really matters because that's the lack of competition to the volume house builders, who will build at the rate they can sell without being undercut by self-builders or custom builders or market entrants who are happy to take a lower margin. Sorry, I'm going on too long. I'll stop at this point. But it is only by having clearer regulation that the people who are already not major in the market can come in and compete and create better places and more places, because we do need more homes. There's very clear evidence of that. I'll come back to that later. So I guess I'd make the case it's about better and clearer regulation, but that does come with some perhaps politically uncomfortable consequences. And I guess to your point, we saw some of that in the by-election. I'll stop there. Sorry, that was too long. Forgive me.
Thank you, Nick. And what's your view on what's Nick said? Is the government going in the right direction in terms of reforming planning regulation? Have they got their priorities right?
Yeah, I would say so. I mean, when I sort of try and explain, the planning system sort of the kind of work I do, I often point out that sort of the single most important thing to know about the English planning system is you can propose things that comply with the local plan, and they can still be rejected at that development management stage. And the kind of key direction of travel that needs to happen to reconnect local supply of housing to local demand and get that kind of closer alignment between what people want and providing the homes that we need is to have a system where if you follow the rules, then you get the build. Now, I think kind of the way in which the government has done this is quite interesting. It's not, people have just kind of sort of described it as a zoning system, and it's certainly a move towards a more rules-based system than what we have currently, with the introduction of growth areas where, once these kind of growth areas allocated in a local plan, development in principle will be allowed to proceed, and renewal areas where there'll be more of kind of a stronger role for design codes in setting out development which can take place in existing suburban areas and urban areas, and the rules of the design code will play a strong role in allowing development to go forward. I think those changes are in the right direction. It's quite different from kind of a lot of classical zoning systems we see in kind of continental Europe, in East Asia, and in parts of the United States as well. So I think if the government are bold, and we can see that there is this political controversy kind of around the planning bill and around some of those elements, but if they implement most of what they've kind of suggested in the white paper and they tie off some of the loose ends that the white paper implies, I think we could make a big step forward to addressing the housing shortage in expensive cities in the UK and in England especially.
And you previously called for some land to be released from the greenbelt to be built on. Are you still of that view? Do we need to bite the bullet and build on greenbelts to solve the housing crisis?
Yeah, so especially if you look around somewhere like London, we can see that London has very high housing need. I think the current target is about 60,000 homes per year. It's building about 40,000 currently. London Council's issued a report yesterday saying that it probably needs to build about over 100,000 homes every year. And the current planning system, the way that functions in London, is because it can't expand outwards because of the greenbelt, and because it also can't do intensification of most of the suburbs. It can't do small sites, kind of knock down existing terraces or semi-detached houses. to build mid-rise apartment buildings. It really, to meet that 40,000 homes a year figure, you get lots of very high density pockets around train stations within London. So kind of around Wembley, around kind of Lewisham, where I live, Elephant and Castle would be another example. And so if you're getting from 40,000 to 100,000, you do start to have to think about, releasing more land for development, but in a strategic and considered way. Like, no one is talking about releasing areas of outstanding natural beauty or national parks for development, but we've set out a proposal for releasing greenbelt land around train stations, feeding into kind of the big cities across England.
Thank you, Ant. Sian, are you receptive to what Ant's proposing there?
I mean, the greenbelt issue is obviously one that comes up every time we discuss the London plan. And I think we have a long way to go within London's current boundaries before we have to start thinking about, and I think if we do start thinking about the greenbelt, it would be along transport corridors or hopping over it and doing stuff outside of the greenbelt. But there is a point to the greenbelt that isn't just about whether or not it's an AONB or a nature site. It is to do with constraining urban sprawl and not ending up with the kind of city where everyone is in car dependent developments. And so I think we've got to make sure that if we're going to make a London plan that's for the very long term, it needs to be phased, and we start by making sure we've done everything we can within our boundaries. And yeah, there are problems with some of the sites that we're trying to use. The former industrial sites that are near railway stations are often done in ways that are eroding trust. And this is the issue, I think, that people take a look at this new planning white paper, and there's been so little trust built up between local communities and developers and the planning authorities over the years, that they look at that with distrust as the frame, and they think, well, I'm not going to have my say here. In what way is this being put together to help developers? Because that's my experience, that developers have the upper hand. And I think this is a really difficult thing to fix. I think some of the things that Nick says are really true in his blogs and things, that people do want to be able to influence things from the start, and then once we've got a plan that we all agree on, things should be got on with, and it opens up space for things like smaller builders. So this is something we do want to solve, but there is no trust at the moment that the government's planning reforms are in good faith, because this has been such a problem for such a long time. People feel that the process just isn't involving them, that they aren't listened to, that their better ideas never make it through and are always gone back on at the last minute. And we've seen that with the Mortlake Brewery site in London, which has recently been turned down by the Mayor of London. The community there have identified that site for development. They want homes on that site, and they've wanted it for years. They've put together their own ideas and plans, but when it came down to it, what came forward from the developers wasn't that, and they therefore spent time fighting it off. But they want to do that to create space for their own ideas, and that, I think, is the challenge we have, is to make a planning system that allows for communities to plan their own local areas, because we'll get lots of homes that way. People really do want new housing. They want the housing that they, for their children to buy, to rent. They want the opportunity to put together community organisations to build their own housing as well, and this is stuff that's just not being facilitated right now.
Nick, can I go to you now? I mean, just listening to what Sian said there, and also, the questions over the greenbelt. I mean, has there been enough of a focus, in your view, in the wider national conversation recently, on the types of homes that we build, as opposed to just sheer numbers? I mean, you're someone who speaks a lot about gentle density. Can gentle density save the greenbelt?
We got the phrase there. Good. I didn't have to put it in. Thank you. No. I mean, you're not asking me about the greenbelt. Just one point on that to answer your question. I mean, there clearly is scope to build on part of the greenbelt, around station nodes, and likewise, as Anthony says, and that is part of the answer. We've made the case in the past for green fingers, not green belts. I mean, I think it is worth saying, because I also agree with what Simon was saying about urban containment. I mean, pretty much every region or economy which has the same types of population spatial pressures that the southeast of England does does have some form of urban containment policy. They're not as well branded as the Green Belt, which is definitely the best branded of the bunch. South Korea, I think, I understand, calls it the Green Belt, but I don't speak Korean, so I haven't been able to directly check that. But it's worth saying, actually, I'm speaking to you from my holidays in France. Countries like France or Germany, which don't have anything like the same type of population spatial pressure, on the whole don't. And actually, frankly, get, in some places, quite American-style sprawl in consequence. But to come back to your point, I think there is enormous potential to gently intensify our existing streets. That's what happened to me, so as well as our phone goes. To gently intensify our existing streets and places. And the good news is a lot of 20th century development was done at very low density, and those are good places to live. I don't knock them. But they can actually, in many cases, just gently, and I think it has to be done in a way that is supported and indeed frequently led by local residents or parishes or groups of neighbours and communities, to go from, let's say, 30 homes a hectare, which is typically what they might be at, to double that, or even add 50%. Or there are lots of places where you can perhaps get a block site, or with agreements say, let's put in place a design code whereby these very strung out, semi-detached, two-story 1930s or 1950s or 60s homes become three-story terraced homes in a bit. And it doesn't have to be done in a way that changes the character of an area. Or sorry, let me rephrase it, that revolutionises the area of a character. It evolves it, as all our towns and cities have done. If you look at any, central streets of any town anywhere that's existed for more than 150 years, you'll see it's completely changed over the last however many years. And I think we have to find a way to consensually allow our streets to evolve in a way that too many haven't over the last few generations. And that if we find a way of more consensually regulating that process, as opposed to having the full development control process, that can then happen again. Because what's changed in the last few generations is you need a developer to do anything difficult. Because the risks are high. Trust me, we give advice on this. Getting planning, the phrase is very telling. Is winning planning permission. That is a telling phrase that is used often in common speech, because there is as Ant touched on, there's a random element to it, or at any rate, an element you need proper professional advice to game the planning system. We've got to make that more straightforward, I think, and that will take pressure off the Greenbelt, and that's the right thing to do.
Thank you. I just want to start weaving in a few audience questions. So we've got a question from Daniel Dipper. Thank you for sending in your question, Daniel. I think I'll give this to Ant. And Daniel says, currently many people live in properties much larger than they need because they can't afford to move. How can that be resolved?
So I think part of what we're seeing there is a kind of mix of some planning problems, and then also I think stamp duty in particular is then particularly problematic kind of feature of our tax system, which makes it inefficient and costly for people in large homes to move, especially for people who are, so the stamp duty element is sort of one thing that's a bit separate from this discussion, but because it's a tax on transactions, it makes it particularly unappealing to move house and to pay stamp duty at that moment in time. So a lot of people are incentivized to stay in homes which are too big for them, while other people are in overcrowded conditions. Another problem is then sort of how the planning system sort of functions and interacts with local government funding and finance. One element to this is that we are very, very bad at providing homes for elderly people, not just care homes, but also retirement communities. And part of that is due to just the lack of development, the lack of land that's fed into the system and can be built on, but also that local councils broadly, because they face a funding crisis related to social care, are very, very reluctant to grant planning permission to developments which they think will actually increase their social care costs in future. So that's one element. Another element is actually that we actually have not enough very small buildings. We have not enough very small flats where, because partly due to minimum space standards, especially in places like London, younger single professional people and people who've moved to London are forced to share big old Edwardian houses, maybe sharing a bathroom between 4 or 5 adults, all in different bedrooms or in converted living rooms, rather than having a situation where everyone has their own private, smaller dwelling where they can live independently and with dignity. So there's kind of a mismatch on two ends. We have these very big houses where people are stuck, and these very, very small houses where people, not enough very small houses where people could live independently. And that's really due to how rigid our planning system is and how difficult it is to develop.
Sean, would you like to come in there?
Yeah, I think so, because I mean, there's an assumption in this debate that that we need to build a lot of homes to solve the housing crisis. And actually, when you look at how the numbers of the need numbers are calculated, a lot of those are from people who are currently living in homes that want to become two households, but potentially the actual buildings are there that could be reconfigured. There's a lot of our housing needs that could be solved by better distributing and arranging the homes that we already own. And again, more relief could be achieved on some of the larger homes, like you've suggested, Ant, by providing better homes for older people to move into. And I think there is more imagination needed than simply just adding numbers, especially if we're just adding market homes for sale to the housing market that are in the answer to solving the housing crisis. And we do need to be thinking about how we work with communities to solve those kinds of problems as well, helping them to identify sites where their older people can go to move to downsize so that family homes can be freed up. And there are examples within London, the very archetypal example of the estate in Southwark, where people were asked, what should you build on this car park area, this garages area of your estate? And they came up with smaller flats for the older people to move into to free up the family homes. This was built and it's genuinely helped the housing crisis on that estate without knocking everything down and rebuilding, and through a process that genuinely had community consent. And we need more of that kind of thing as well, not simply how do we get volume up and how do we serve the volume house builders. Definitely.
Nick, would you like to come in?
Just very quickly, I agree with most of that. And I certainly strongly agree about the, communities will make the case themselves if you let them, and that's most work I spend most of my working day doing. So profoundly and emotionally buy into that. I mean, I think it is worth saying, whilst it is true that if it was easier to move between house types of different sizes, we can't escape the fact that there is an undersupply of housing in some areas, and I think it's important not to. I know, Sean, you're not quite saying that, but I think someone let's just say that starkly.
The extent of the numbers and the reliance on just shouting out numbers drives me a little bit mad.
I'm not trying to drive you mad, I promise. But if you look at the ratio of homes to households comparatively across countries, and that doesn't take account of suppressed household formation, which is almost certainly, in fact, is certainly going on in the UK, or rather not going on. Our ratio is about 1 to 1. So, and of course, that sounds fine, except it's not really, because as I think in a way Ant just touched on, if you've got a 4-person household in Devon, the fact that there's a free single person flat in Cumbria isn't of much help. So you need a bit of oversupply to allow for the fungibility of the market. And that is our sort of 1-to-1 ratio is basically the tightest in Europe. The average is about 1.12. So we can't escape that. And then when you factor in that the UK economy, and this is perhaps another discussion point, is abnormally spatially focused on London and a few other hotspots, that then makes that grotesque, overwhelming undersupply, more problematic. So there is a need for more homes in more places, but I agree there's opportunity to have more fungibility between house types, and I think some interesting opportunities coming post-COVID, possibly, if we get less London focused.
Sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, you'll never get perfect redistribution, but at the moment, the only policies there are for redistribution within council housing tenures. There's no strategy for helping people in privately owned homes to redistribute. With renting, it is actually slightly better distributed anyway, because people can move more easily. But at the moment, there just isn't a policy that tries to help people.
Well, stamp duty is a constraint.
It won't solve everything, but it will contribute to bringing down the numbers required.
I think Sham's point there about that almost kind of quality versus quantity point is really important. And the way I sort of see this is, it seems to me that the quantity problem is so bad in the UK that policy is so focused on squeezing quantity just a little bit that we make big compromises on quality. And I think that means kind of the solution then is, if we want to improve quality, we need to fix the quantity problem. And if you compare the UK to its peers abroad, right, we build about 240,000 homes a year. That's kind of a decades-long high. France is building about 400,000 homes a year. Japan is building about 800,000 homes a year, and they're twice as big as us, but their population is also falling. So I think there's an element here where, if we solve that supply problem, if we can kind of crack the nut, as we've been talking about how our planning system makes it so unpredictable and so risky, I think we can then get into those really kind of important strategic priorities of getting more housing for elderly people in terms of targeting support for those groups who are really struggling and really suffering in the current housing crisis.
And outrageously, sorry, Phoebe, we're not letting you back in, so forgive me, but also that outrageously, and perhaps I should have said this earlier, we're not creating, I mean, I think almost uniquely in the market economy, we're not creating better places than we used to create. So if you look at, and if you look at price differentials for existing older settlements versus newer settlements, the premium associated with certain elements of more traditional and older settlement patterns in most of the country is higher than the new build premium. Now, if you just sort of stop and think about that for a moment, that is sort of ridiculous. So what it means is the value we're able to create to people from a new build home, with all the advantages that in some ways does have, and in some ways certainly should have, is less than the value associated with being able to live in a settlement where you can walk to the shops and get some of the functionality, and actually I'll say the word beauty, of some existing places. And there are surveys which show that about 20% of people would regard a new build home as their preferred option, and that 2/3 of people would never consider a newly built home. Now, even if you discount some of that, that clearly means we're not creating places that people value enough. And this is certainly true. You see this in people's instinctive response to proposed developments near them. It's not just a lack of control that Sean absolutely rightly touches on. It's also just an instinctive belief that new development will spoil an area. And until very recently, the National Planning Policy Framework actually sort of made that assumption. And it said, you just need to be able to prove it won't do much harm. Well, I mean, if our assumption is that new places just won't make it much worse, we've just completely given up any aspiration as a society that development can make places better, which actually they can do, and they used to, and they should do again. Sorry, rant over.
Sean, you don't seem convinced that the housing crisis is fundamentally an issue of supply and demand. Would you consider more radical reforms of the financing available to help people actually get on the property ladder in the first place?
I mean, I kind of want deeper changes to the housing market than simply helping people get on the property ladder. I genuinely think people want security in their housing. They want a secure place to live for all of their lives. And so improvements to renting tenures is something I work on. I want to make sure that renting feels secure and isn't just something that people desperately want to get out of. Again, those surveys of people and what they want to do, that contributes to the housing targets, that goes into the models. So if we can make renting better, we can make it more empowered so that people don't feel so helpless as private renters, that would be amazing. And I want to see more community-led housing. I think, this is the big gap. And I think the things that you've been talking about to do with the risks involved in getting planning permission, all of those things are a barrier to entering the market for community-led housing, for cooperatives, for non-profit renting providers. And at the moment we're seeing in London, for example, local councils and the mayor, and I've made proposals myself to the GLA budget of state involvement directly in building and providing affordable rented accommodation, some of it social housing, some of it at London living rent, which is a new tenure we've defined in London. These are good things, but at the moment the only people who can do it, who've got the sort of the security and the ability to borrow at low levels and all of that are state actors, and that's great and it proves the principle, but I'd love to see that opened up to more genuinely community-led organisations to do that as well.
Thank you, Sean. We're going to sort of have to start coming to an end now. It's been a very in-depth discussion, but the title of the event is Are NIMBYs the Problem? So we can just go around and get a yes or a no from each of you. And NIMBYs, are they the problem?
I think they're part of the problem, but I also think that the planning reforms that are coming forward should actually reduce some of the concerns that they have, while also increasing overall supply. I think there's a win-win to be had here.
Thank you. Nick?
Yes, no is impossible. A human response to change to a place in which you live is natural, and to condemn that as some developers do as emotional is to sort of miss the point. Humans are emotional, and home is emotional. Where you live, where you bring up your children, where you go to see your mum, that's an emotional thing. It should be emotional, and no one should condemn anyone for that. So I wrote a book a few years ago called Love the NIMBY and Build More Homes. And I think if we can understand better what concerns NIMBYs in inverted commas, and to some degree, as far as possible, by working with them, by empowering people, by creating as a society better and more lovable and more sustainable and greener places, many, not all, of those concerns can be undermined. And above all, it's about giving people confidence about the consequences of development for them and the people they know, and understanding that people either they trust or respect have fed into the framework for that. So I think ultimately, NIMBYism will never go away, nor should it. But if we can help channel it into making better places, as opposed to an instinctive, oh, here is change, this must be a bad thing, that ultimately is the only answer, because it can't be killed, nor should it be.
Sean?
Yeah, I reject the term entirely. I mean, people rightly want to be involved in how their local area develops and changes, and actually often have the best ideas. And I think it's just really important that we don't mischaracterize people who are objecting to something that's been imposed on them from above as simply a negative thing. They are generally doing that because they have better ideas and they're aggrieved that they don't have the power to bring them in.
Well, thank you. That is where we have to leave it. Many thanks to Sean, Nick and Ant for their time and thoughts, and also to our audience for joining us today and sending in their questions. Do join us on the next episode of Bright Blue TV, which is on Friday, the 3rd of September at 12 o'clock, in which we'll ask, does class still matter? With guests Justine Greening, Professor Lee Elliott Major, and Dr. David Jeffrey. Goodbye.